Hi there. This is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 16. Mountains like these and travelers in the mountains and events that happen to them are not found only in Zen literature but in the tales of every major religion. The allegory of a physical mountain for the spiritual one that stands between each soul and its goal is an easy and natural one to make. Like those in the valley behind us, most people stand in sight of the spiritual mountains all their lives and never enter them, being content to listen to others who have been there and thus avoid the hardships. Some travel into the mountains accompanied by experienced guides who know the best and least dangerous routes by which they arrive at their destination. Still others, inexperienced and untrusting, attempt to make their own rules. Few of these are successful, but occasionally some, by sheer will and luck and grace, do make it. Once there, they become more aware than any of the others that there's no single or fixed number of routes. There are as many routes as there are individual souls. Okay, so that's a lot of what we're talking about here in this corner of the internet. Why is it that some people can get a hold of a spiritual path and others can't? And the other debate is, are there really that many individual spiritual paths? What does that mean? Does it mean that even if you're in a very organized form of Christianity, that you find your own path in there? Or does it mean there's a whole lot of different ways to do spirituality and they're not cohesive? What I like about this paragraph is that you have it there. It's available to you for the taking, really. And so many people don't take it. And that is, I think, in my opinion, there's plenty of people who will say it's not necessary, it's not a path that's going to, that you should take, that's a path to self-deception. I don't think so. I'm struggling with this, but how to characterize it, what path to take. But I'll tell you this: I'm glad I'm taking it. So the narrator and his son are in the mountains around Bozeman for a few days with their cycles, and the home base is at the Deweeses, so they can stay at the Deweeses. They can go up in the mountains. So in this chapter, the narrator is going to start to work out, let's just say, applied quality in classroom experiment. So he points out there were two phases in his exploration of quality. There's the first, the fun phase, applied quality, which is, exploratory and is just kind of creatively happening in the classroom. The second one was the actual formulation of the new metaphysics, and that wasn't so fun. As he says, he literally had to move heaven and earth to arrive at the new systems, which we know to be the metaphysics of quality. So this next section, I'm going to read it in its entirety for a couple of reasons. One is that it illustrates, it's another illustration of the recurring significance of the mountain in this book. But another reason I'm going to read it is it's one of the few areas in this book which directly addresses Christianity. And I'm very interested in Pirsig's views on religion. In fact, I'd love to do a whole video on that, a long video on that, and that's going to take me a while to formulate. But it's hard to get an understanding of what he thinks of Western religion. And this is interesting because if you're following Jonathan Pageau's work, you're going to find a lot of parallels to what he says about language with something Pageau said. So listen carefully to this paragraph if you're following Pageau's work. In this paragraph, he's describing the need for a new system or new metaphysics. If it was truly a new route over the mountain, and it's certainly a needed one, the new metaphysics, For more than 3 centuries now, the old roots common in this hemisphere have been undercut and almost washed out by the natural erosion and change of the shape of the mountain, wrought by scientific truth. The early climbers established paths that were on firm ground, with an accessibility that appealed to all. But today the western routes are all but closed because of dogmatic inflexibility in the face of change. To doubt the literal meaning of the words of Jesus or Moses incurs hostility from most people, most fundamentalists, I guess. But it's just a fact that if Jesus or Moses were to appear today, unidentified, with the same message he spoke many years ago, his mental stability would be challenged. This isn't because what Jesus or Moses said was untrue, but because modern society's in error, but simply because the route they chose to reveal to others has lost relevance and comprehensibility. Heaven above fades from meaning when space-age consciousness asks, where is above? Peugeot. But the fact that the old roots have tended, because of language rigidity, to lose their everyday meaning and become almost closed doesn't mean that the mountain is no longer there. It's there, and it will be as long as consciousness exists. So Peugeot has said virtually the same thing about the language of the Bible. And to try to understand the language in modern terms is to miss the symbolism altogether. The mountain is still there. Of course, Phaedrus didn't take the Christian route. He took a more Eastern route, let's just say, an Eastern route. He took a philosophical route that was the meeting of East and West. And rather than revivifying Christianity like Jonathan is doing, Phaedrus attempted to restructure our understanding of reality in a different way. The reason that Pirsig's work fits so well into this corner of YouTube is because he is restructuring things. He's restructuring. This is the trajectory that we're doing over here, let's just say. In the second phase of his quest, the second part where he's actually trying to codify the metaphysics, you know that Phaedrus lost everything. He lost his family, he lost money, he even lost Phaedrus, through the electroshock. And now it's up to the narrator to piece it all back together. When I first discovered this debris, meaning the memories started to emerge, I felt like some agricultural peasant near the outskirts of, say, Athens, who occasionally and without much surprise plows up stones that have strange designs on them. I knew that these were part of some larger overall designs that existed in the past, but it was far beyond my comprehension. Later, when I developed more confidence in my immunity to his affliction, I became interested in this debris in a more positive way. So here the narrator is going to talk about phase 1 in this chapter. And this is the fun phase, let's say, the creative and fulfilling phase, not the metaphysical phase. And Pirsig actually, he'll mention this in the book, but he took the class notes. He took, as a professor, this was when he was teaching rhetoric in Bozeman, he took his class notes to reconstruct how Phaedrus had applied quality to the teaching of rhetoric. And he discovers through the reaction of a dull student who can't think of anything to say for her essay. This dull student, is totally stumped at even writing an essay on the town of Bozeman, even writing an essay on the main street of Bozeman. He was furious. "You're not looking," he said. A memory came back of his own dismissal from the university for having too much to say. For every fact, there is an infinity of hypotheses. The more you look, the more you see. She really wasn't looking, and yet somehow didn't understand this. He told her angrily, "Narrow it down to the front of one building on the main street of Bozeman, the Opera House. Start with the upper left-hand brick." So she's befuddled, but she's a diligent student, so she follows his directions, and then something interesting happens. She starts writing about the brick, and then she writes about the second brick, and then the third, and then it flows and flows and flows. And she ends up passing in a 5,000-word essay on the front of the opera house. She doesn't really understand how this flow, from going to absolutely nothing to say about the main street of Bozeman to this flow of writing. And she doesn't get it, and he doesn't either. But then he realizes she was blocked because she was trying to repeat in her writing things she had already heard. She was strangely unaware that she could look and see freshly for herself. As she wrote, without primary regard for what had been said before, the narrowing down to one brick destroyed the blockage because it was so obvious she had to do some original and direct seeing. Okay, that is a very important phrase when it comes to what we're looking at in this book. Original and direct seeing. In fact, in a way, that's what he's trying to get us to do. That might be one of the essential messages of this book. And freshness is the watchword. So producing imitations within a closed system of safety is a low-quality venture indeed. What is needed is a dynamic way of seeing that is your own and that is immediate. It's a freshness of, let's just say, reaction, or freshness of perception is the better word. As a result of his experiments, he concluded that imitation was a real evil that had to be broken before real rhetoric teaching could begin. This imitation seemed to be an external compulsion. Little children didn't have it. It seemed to come later on, possibly as a result of school itself. Okay, so little kids really do have a fresh vision of reality. And a lot of metaphor there exists in Eastern philosophy, but I think even I can't remember that poem, but it's in Jordan Peterson's TED Talk, where you see everything you've seen before freshly for the first time. So that child's mind. In that poem, the writer has the freshness of childhood. He loses it, and then he goes back. He becomes like a child again in what he sees. So I'm going to put the link to what that poem is in the description. So Fieders figures that what schools teach you is how to imitate, but to be clever enough to seem like you're not imitating, and there are boundless implications for that insight. So just think about, fitting in one way or another. That's how you do it. You follow a course that you fit in with everyone else, but you, in this country at least, you give the impression you're doing it individually. Like the hipster. Remember when that hipster, I can't remember when it was, but on YouTube they showed something. No, it was an article where this hipster got mad that they used his photo without permission, and it was actually the photo of another hipster. So there you go. So he continues his experiments, which now have included the directive to write about the back of your thumb. And the experiment, to focus on such a narrow thing, you have to be fresh because you can't reference writing about the back of the thumb. You really just have to do it. And so asking the students to do that yields total engagement by the students, and they just write for a whole hour about the back of their thumb. So there's another experiment that comes up in which the class will no longer receive grades, and this experiment emerges after he directs a student. He gets this idea that maybe not having grades is going to teach people to be a little bit more, to have a fresher vision of their writing, just sort of an intuition. And so the student can't think of a topic for her paper. So he says, well, we'll just write about this. What if we didn't have grades? And it's a revelation to her. She's very bright. And she totally sees the potential of this experiment and then tries to convince her fellow students of the merit of a gradeless and degreeless university system. Her tone took on an old-time religious fervor. She begged the other students to listen, to understand. This was really right. I'm not saying this for him, she said, and glanced at Phaedrus. It's for you. I've been pronouncing Phaedrus wrong. John Vervaeke, when he pronounced it, I realized, oh, okay, it's Phaedrus. The next quarter, he begins another experiment, something called a demonstrator, which is a piece of persuasive writing, a demonstrator. And that's basically what rhetoric is, and he does it with the class so they can see his process, and he doesn't correct it. They sort of work on it together. And the demonstrator is the trajectory of a student for whom the grading system doesn't work. And so we'll get to that in a minute, but you'll notice in this book that much of the book is in fact presented this way, as demonstrations of how his inquiry into values is formulating this new metaphysics. And I think this is why he's chosen the novel format. He doesn't say, well, here, like sometimes he lists the thought process and he tells you what he's doing, but a lot of times he doesn't. He shows you, he demonstrates, and this is why I think he picked the novel form. He demonstrates, for example, how a romantic type will react to motorcycle maintenance versus a classic type, and how the romantic and classic types react to the world in general, to technology. Through John and Sylvia, he's demonstrating these attitudes of society through these characters. He demonstrates classic rationality by listing the parts of the motorcycles and then dividing them into parts and functions. And he demonstrates at the beginning, remember, how quality emerges out of the void, like blackbirds emerging out of a swamp. And there's segues, of course, with he and Chris in the mountains, and he's demonstrating how the problems that Chris is struggling with, he's demonstrating how Chris is struggling with some of his psychological issues, and demonstrating how the narrator's inability to connect fully, for he and Chris to connect fully, while he's sort of missing a lot of himself, makes for some tension. See those two aspens over there, the straight ones at the edge? I point to them. Cut those down about a foot from the ground. Why? We'll need them later for hiking sticks and tent poles. Chris takes the machete, starts to rise, but then settles back down. You cut them, he says. So I take the machete and go over and cut the poles. They both cut neatly in one swing, except for the final strip of bark, which I sever with the back hook of the machete. Up in the rocks, you need the poles for balancing, and the pine up above is no good for poles. What a classic guy. Very rational. And this is about the last of the aspen here. It bothers me a little, though, that Chris is turning down work. Not a good sign in the mountains. So we go back to the, there's several of these segues, of course. This is the structure of the novel. But we go back to Phaedrus, the rhetoric teacher at the University of Bozeman. And he, And there is a hypocrisy to the university system that few want to admit, and that really you're there for the grades and for the degree. To actually learn stuff, meh, especially these days, really think about it. Think about how universities are advertised on the subway and just wherever you see advertising. They focus on the money you're going to make after you get this certificate or this degree, whatever. I wonder what Pirsig would have thought about how universities operate today. Education often seems secondary, especially in light of all this politicalization on the campuses, where what you hear about most of all these days is what happens socially. And I'm going to say something bold, but I think it's true. You have access to the best resources for obtaining knowledge in the world right here on YouTube. And you have communities in which to develop that knowledge so you don't fall into the self-deception of autodidacticism that John Vervaeke warns about. I think this is a golden age for education. And I think Pirsig would agree. The demonstrator was an argument that elimination of grades and degrees would destroy this hypocrisy, rather than deal with the generalities it dealt with, the specific career of an imaginary student who is more or less typified, what was found in the classroom, a student completely conditioned to work for a grade rather than for the knowledge the grade was supposed to represent. So this hypothetical student without the pressure of grades and who actually has a life outside of the university skips assignments. By skipping assignments, doesn't really get what's going on in the lecture so much, falls further behind, and then ultimately drops out. So he's low status. He's a dropout. But Phaedrus argues that this is actually good because he obviously was only there for the degree and not the knowledge, and now he's saved himself a lot of time and money. So needing work, or potentially he's having to be practical, he becomes, say, a mechanic, and his status is raised now because he's contributing to society. So after years of working, it says a mechanic in the book, but we're going to assume it's a motorcycle mechanic, he hones his craft and starts to get bored, and he's also done a fair amount of experimentation and restructuring engines and whatnot, and become a very good mechanic. And he may want more knowledge. So he goes back to the gradeless, degreeless school, but this time he goes back because he wants to know stuff. Perhaps even he wants to know engineering, maybe even physics or metallurgy. And so the sky's the limit now. The student's biggest problem was a slave mentality, which had been built into him by years of carrot and whip grading. A mule mentality, which said, if you don't whip me, I won't work. He didn't get whipped, he didn't work, and the cart of civilization, which he supposedly was being trained to pull, was just going to have to creak along a little slower without it. This is a tragedy, however, only if you presume that the cart of civilization, the system, is pulled by mules. The purpose of abolishing grades and degrees is not to punish the mules or to get rid of them, but to provide an environment in which that mule can turn into a free man. So using this persuasion, he begins the experiment of gradelessness. He's not going to give grades in his class. So the students react with indifference, ambivalence, lack of participation, and general laziness as a reaction to the relief of the burden of grades. But he outweights this, and the students start to become engaged. They start to improve, and for all intents and purposes, the experiment is a success, and the teaching is exposed for what it is, the installation of the skill of imitating and fitting into the system. And then, without the grades, the students are free to be creative. The movement from this to his inquiry into quality took place because of a sinister aspect of grading that the withholding of grades exposed. Grades really cover up failure to teach. A bad instructor can go through the entire quarter, leaving absolutely nothing memorable in the minds of his class, curve out the scores on an irrelevant test, and leave the impression that some have learned and some have not. So the gradelessness is a success, but there's a problem that emerges. For many of the students, this withholding created a Kafkaesque situation in which they saw they were punished for failure to do something, but no one would tell them what they were supposed to do. They looked within themselves and saw nothing, and looked at Phaedrus and saw nothing, and just sat there helpless, not knowing what to do. The vacuum was deadly. One girl suffered a nervous breakdown. You cannot withhold grades and sit there and create a goalless vacuum. You have to provide some goal for a class to work toward that will fill that vacuum. This he wasn't doing. What does that remind you of? Well, one thing we're discussing here is the meaning crisis, for example, is if you take away God, what's going to take his place? So that's kind of structured in that way. Ultimately, because of this void, more than half the students oppose the new system, so Phaedrus has to ditch it, to his dismay, since he too has a vacuum concerning quality. He had not been able to apply quality in a way that was complete. It wasn't going to stick because there's a critical element missing. Let's just call it, yeah, this vacuum. And so with that realization, phase one, the fun phase of his investigation into quality, was over. The next quarter, he dropped the whole idea and went back to regular grading, discouraged, confused, feeling he was right somehow, but it had come out all wrong. When spontaneity and individuality and really good original stuff occurred in the classroom, it was in spite of the instruction, not because of it. This seemed to make sense. He was ready to resign. Teaching dull conformity to hateful students wasn't what he wanted to do. During the rest of the summer, his mood became depressed and lazy. He and his wife camped a lot in these mountains. She asked why he was so silent all the time, but he couldn't say why. He was just stopped, waiting for that missing seed crystal of thought that would suddenly solidify everything. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next Sunday for chapter 17.